They told her she was worthless. Every door slammed in her face. Every foreman laughed her off the property before she could even finish a sentence. Eliza Whitmore had worked cattle since she was 8 years old, could read weather better than most men twice her age, and had never once quit when things got hard. But none of that mattered in a world that had already decided what she was allowed to be. This is the story of a woman who had nothing left, walked into one last ranch, and changed 3 lives forever. Stay with me until the end. This one will hit you somewhere deep. If stories like this speak to your soul, hit that subscribe button and become part of our family. You won't want to miss what comes next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see just how far this story travels. The summer of 1883 was the kind that cracked the earth open. Out on the high plains of western Kansas, the grass had gone the color of old straw, and the sky sat heavy and white from horizon to horizon. Not the white of clouds, but the white of a sun that had simply stopped caring. Dust devils spun up between the wagon ruts and died just as quickly. The whole landscape felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Eliza Whitmore had been walking since before dawn. Her boots were the kind of worn that goes past worn. The left sole had separated at the toe, and she'd tied it back with a strip of leather cut from her saddlebag, which she no longer had a horse to put on. The saddlebag hung from her shoulder instead, stuffed with 3 days' worth of dried jerky, a change of shirt, and a small tin box where she kept what remained of her money. She hadn't counted it again that morning. She already knew what she'd find. Harlan Creek was the 4th town she'd tried in 6 weeks. The first had been Dusty Fork, where the ranch foreman, a barrel-chested man named Holt, who smelled like tobacco and sour milk, had looked her up and down from his porch, spit off the side and said, "We don't run a charity here, girl. Move along." She hadn't asked for charity. She'd asked for work. The second town was Mineral Flat, where she'd gotten further, all the way to the owner himself, a man named Pruitt, who wore a silk vest and kept touching the chain of his pocket watch while she spoke. He'd listened, or at least he'd stood there while she talked. Then he'd smiled at her the way men smile at things they find amusing but not serious, and said, "Tell you what, my wife could use some help in the kitchen." "I'm not looking for kitchen work," Eliza had said, keeping her voice even. "I know cattle. I know horses. I know irrigation and fencing and how to treat a sick steer without losing half your herd to whatever's going around." The smile didn't waver. "I'm sure you do, sweetheart." She'd left before she said something that would follow her to the next town. The third was a place called Cutter's Ridge, and she didn't even make it to a conversation. The foreman there, young, probably 22, with a patchy beard he was clearly proud of, had taken one look at her walking up the road and called out to the men working the fence line, "Hey boys, come look at this." She'd turned around and kept walking and didn't let herself feel it until she was a mile down the road and out of sight. Then she sat behind a cottonwood tree for about 10 minutes and felt it. Then she got up and kept going. Harlan Creek had maybe 400 people, a main street with a general store, a feed supply, a saloon, a post office, and a Baptist church that looked like it was losing an argument with gravity. There was a livery stable at the far end of the street and a water trough out front where a spotted mule stood sleeping. Eliza stopped at the general store first, not to buy anything, but because it was the kind of place where people knew things. A woman with gray-streaked hair and sharp eyes was sweeping the front steps when Eliza walked up. "Morning," Eliza said. "I'm looking for ranch work. Anything around here that might be hiring?" The woman stopped sweeping and looked at her, not unkindly exactly, but with the careful appraisal of someone who knew what the world was like and had made her peace with it. "You passing through? Looking to settle, if the work holds?" The woman's mouth pressed together slightly. "There's the Carver operation east of town. Big spread. But Carver doesn't—" She paused. "He's particular about who he hires. I can handle particular." "It's not about that." The woman looked down at her broom. "He just doesn't hire women. None of them around here do." Eliza had heard this before. "None of them." The woman hesitated, just a beat. "There's Mercer, I suppose, Caleb Mercer. His place is about 3 miles south, past the creek bend, but—" She shook her head a little. "It's a struggling outfit, been struggling for years. Caleb's a decent man, but he's barely keeping it together. Lost 2 hired hands this spring. She glanced up. I don't know if he'd consider it. Hasn't cost anything yet to ask, Eliza said. The woman looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, once, with something in her eyes that might have been respect or might have been pity. Eliza had stopped trying to tell the difference. South past the creek bend, the woman repeated. Can't miss the fence line. Half of it's fallen down. Then she found Carver's operation first because it was hard to miss. A prosperous-looking spread with good fencing and a bunkhouse and 3 men working in the near paddock. She went to the main building and asked to speak to whoever was in charge of hiring. She got a man named Deeks, the foreman, who was polite enough to hear her out. He had a weathered face and the kind of stillness that came from spending 30 years outdoors. You got references? He asked. I worked the Harmon spread in Colorado for 4 years. Before that, my father's ranch in Missouri from the time I could walk. Harmon's a long way off. Yes, sir. He studied her. It's not about whether you can do the work, he said, and his voice had dropped a register, something almost apologetic in it. The men, they don't take well to... He stopped. Started again. It causes problems, arguments, distractions. It's just not something that works out here. I'm not a distraction, Eliza said. I'm a ranch hand. Miss, he said it quietly, not cruelly. I'm sorry. I can't help you. She walked back out into the sun and stood at the gate for a moment. 3 miles south, Ichscout. The Mercer place looked exactly like the woman in town had described it, a ranch that was fighting a slow battle and losing. The fence line along the road had 2 sections down, posts rotted out at the base. The barn needed paint so badly the wood had gone gray and dry. The main house was solid but modest, and the yard had the particular look of a place where one person was trying to do the work of 4. There was a man working near the water trough, wrestling with a hand pump that clearly didn't want to cooperate. He was maybe 35, lean and broad-shouldered, his hat pushed back on his head. He had the kind of face that had spent too much time squinting into wind. Not old exactly, but tired in a specific way that the outdoors puts into a person. He noticed her when she was about 20 feet out and straightened up. Help you? He said. I'm looking for Caleb Mercer. That's me. Eliza squared her shoulders. She had done this speech 4 times now, and each time she tried to say it differently, tried to find the arrangement of words that would make someone actually hear her. She still hadn't found it. My name is Eliza Whitmore. I'm looking for ranch work. I've got 4 years on the Harmon spread in Colorado. Primarily cattle management, some horse work, fencing, irrigation repair. Before that, I spent most of my life on a working ranch in Missouri. I'm not looking for special treatment. I'm looking for honest pay for honest work. Caleb Mercer looked at her, not the way Pruitt had looked at her, not the way Deeks had. This was a different kind of looking. He wasn't dismissing her. He also wasn't agreeing to anything. How long you been walking? He asked. Blinked. Since before sunup. He glanced down at her boots, at the leather strip tied around the toe. He didn't say anything about it. I'm not in a position to hire anyone, he said finally. I'll be honest with you. The money's tight, and I don't know how tight it gets before it becomes something worse. Taking on wages I can't guarantee wouldn't be fair to you. I'd rather take that chance than... I'm not done. He wasn't rude about it, just direct. I'm not saying no. I'm saying I can't offer you what I can't offer. He tilted his head slightly. What I can do is, if you're willing to work a trial week, I can offer you meals and a bunk in the tack room. It's not fancy. At the end of the week, if the work is there and you're what you say you are, we talk about something more permanent. It wasn't what she'd hoped for. It also wasn't a door slamming in her face. All right, she said. He nodded and reached out to shake her hand, which she hadn't expected. His grip was firm and brief. You can put your bag in the tack room. I'll show you where. They walked toward the barn, and that's when she saw the horse. It was a dark bay mare in the near paddock, standing slightly apart from the others. Something about the way it held its weight was wrong. Anyone who knew horses would see it. The animal was resting its right front foot, toe down, with a careful, deliberate stillness that meant pain. How long has she been standing like that? Eliza said. Caleb stopped. Few hours. She seemed off this morning. I was going to look at her after I got the pump. But Eliza was already moving toward the paddock gate, already reading the horse the way she'd learned to read them. The tight muscles around the jaw, the way the ears sat, the angle of the leg. "She's not lame," Eliza said, mostly to herself, slipping through the gate and moving toward the mare at an angle, slow and steady, talking low. "Easy, easy, girl. I'm not going to hurt you." The mare shifted but didn't bolt. Eliza crouched beside her and ran her hands down the leg, felt nothing wrong in the bone or tendon, then lifted the hoof and turned it into the light. There it was, a piece of flint, the size of a thumbnail, wedged deep into the sulcus beside the frog. Another few hours, and it would have worked its way in deep enough to cause real damage. An abscess, maybe worse. Eliza reached into her jacket pocket and found the small folding knife she always kept there, opened the blade and worked carefully. The horse flinched once, then stood. 30 seconds later, Eliza straightened up and held out her palm. The piece of flint sat there, dark against her skin. She looked back at Caleb. He was standing at the paddock fence, both hands resting on the top rail, watching her. The expression on his face was hard to read. Something had shifted in it, some internal calculation being made. "She'll be fine," Eliza said. "Keep her out of the rocky ground for a couple of days." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tack room's at the back of the barn. There's a cot behind the saddle rack. I'll have supper ready around 6. He picked up his hat from where he'd left it on the fence post and walked back toward the house without another word. Eliza looked down at the piece of flint in her hand. She closed her fingers around it. She had been told 4 times in 6 weeks, and more times than that in the years before, that she was too small, too soft, too female, too much of something and not enough of everything else. She had been told she would quit when the work got hard. She had been told the West was no place for a woman without a husband or a family name to stand behind. What none of them had ever understood was that she'd grown up watching her father work himself half to death, trying to hold a ranch together alone, and she'd made a quiet decision when she was about 12 years old that she would never be the kind of person who needed to be carried through life. She would carry her own weight. She would carry more than her weight, if it came to that. She was tired. Her feet hurt. She had 63 cents to her name and a left boot held together with scavenged leather. But she was inside the fence line. She uncurled her fingers and looked at the flint one more time. Then she set it on the top rail of the paddock fence. A small, meaningless gesture that made sense only to her, and walked toward the barn. The mare watched her go, weight balanced evenly now, ears forward. The pump still needed fixing. The fencing was still down. The barn still needed paint. There was, Eliza thought, no shortage of work. She pushed open the tack room door and went inside. The tack room smelled like leather and old hay, and something else underneath, a kind of dry, closed-in stillness that comes from a space that hasn't had a regular occupant in a long time. The cot Caleb had mentioned was behind the saddle rack, just as he'd said, a narrow thing with a wool blanket folded at the foot that had probably been washed sometime last year, maybe the year before. There was a small window up near the ceiling, the kind that let in light but not much else, and a nail on the wall where someone had left a rusted spur hanging like a forgotten thought. Eliza set her saddlebag down on the cot and sat beside it. She had slept in worse places. She'd slept in a dry creek bed once, wrapped in her bedroll with her back against the bank, listening to coyotes argue somewhere in the dark. This was considerably better than that. She pulled off her left boot, carefully because the leather strip needed retying, and set both boots side by side on the floor and looked at them for a moment. 63 cents, a trial week, meals, and a cot. It wasn't much. But she'd been working with not much her entire life, and there was a particular kind of clarity that came with it. When you have very little, you stop spending energy on things that don't matter, and you focus hard on the things that do. She retied the boot, stood up, and went back outside to find the pump. Supper that first evening was quiet, in a way that had texture to it. The kitchen was at the back of the main house, a practical room with a wood stove that heated more than just the food, and a table that had 4 chairs around it but felt like it had always only ever used 2. Caleb stood at the stove with his back to her when she knocked on the doorframe, and he said, "Come in," without turning around, the way people do when they're used to knowing exactly who's at the door because nobody else ever comes. There was a woman at the table. She was old. The kind of old that has settled deep into the bones, past the stage of fighting it. 70, maybe more. She sat very straight, which Eliza would later learn was deliberate, a point of pride she maintained with visible effort. Her hair was white and pinned back tightly, and she had eyes the particular gray-blue of creek water in early morning, clear, cold, and paying attention to everything. She looked at Eliza the way a woman looks at something she has not yet decided what to make of. "This is my grandmother, Martha Mercer," Caleb said from the stove. "Martha, this is Eliza Whitmore. She's going to be working a trial week." "So you said," Martha replied, not to Caleb, but still looking at Eliza. "Ma'am," Eliza said. Martha said nothing for a moment, then, "Sit down, then. No point standing in the doorway." It wasn't warm exactly, but it wasn't the door in the face she'd half expected, so Eliza sat. Supper was salt pork and beans and cornbread that had come out slightly dense. Caleb's cooking, she would learn, was earnest but limited. He knew how to keep himself alive, and that was about the extent of it. He set a plate in front of Martha first, then one in front of Eliza, then sat down himself, and for a few minutes the only sound was the scrape of forks and the pop of the stove. "You worked cattle before?" Martha said, without looking up from her plate. "Yes, ma'am, since I was a girl." "Where'd you come from?" "Missouri, originally, last few years in Colorado." "What happened in Colorado?" Eliza looked up. It was a blunt question, the kind that assumed something had happened, which was fair enough because something had. "The Harmon outfit sold. The family went back east. I needed to find work." Martha looked at her then. "So you just wandered out here on your own?" "I followed the work." "The work." Martha repeated it in a way that suggested she found this answer either impressive or suspicious, and hadn't yet decided which. Caleb cleared his throat. "The pump's running better," he said, a pivot so obvious even he seemed to know it. "Whatever you did to it this afternoon, the packing was dried out. I soaked it in lard. It'll hold for a while, but the leather inside needs replacing eventually." He nodded. "I'll get the part next time I'm in town." They ate the rest of the meal with less conversation, but it was a different kind of quiet than it had been at the start. Martha still watched Eliza in that measuring way of hers, but the watching had shifted slightly. Less like a woman looking at an intruder, and more like a woman trying to solve something. The work started before the sun was fully up. Not because Caleb asked her to be up early. He hadn't given her a schedule or a list of tasks. But Eliza had always worked by the principle that if you need to be told when to start, you're already behind, and she'd spent too many years getting up with the animals to sleep past their first sounds. She was in the barn before Caleb came out of the house, feeding the horses and checking on the bay mare's hoof, which was clean and healing fine. When Caleb came in and found the horses already fed and the stall nearest the door freshly mucked, he stood in the barn doorway for a moment and said nothing. Then he picked up a pitchfork and started on the next stall over. They worked side by side in silence for a while, and it was a comfortable silence, the kind that comes between people who understand that work itself is a kind of conversation. By the third day, Eliza had found the gaps in the operation. Not because she'd gone looking to criticize, but because gaps are hard to miss when you know what a functioning ranch looks like. The grazing rotation was off. Cattle were wearing down a section of the south pasture, while the east field sat largely untouched. Two of the fence posts in the north line were packed too loose and would pull out in a decent wind. The water supply to the livestock trough near the barn was slow, suggesting a partial blockage somewhere in the pipe run. She mentioned the fence post to Caleb on the third morning, standing at the fence line with the sun still low and a cup of coffee cooling in her hand. "I noticed the posts back there are loose." He looked where she nodded. "Yeah, I know. I've been meaning to—" He stopped. "There's always something else first. I can repack them this afternoon, if you've got the gravel and the tamper." He looked at her sideways. "You know how to set fence posts." "I know how to do most things that need doing on a ranch," she said, without attitude in it, just stating a fact. He drank his coffee. "Gravel's by the barn. Tamper's hanging inside the door." It was Martha who gave her the hardest time, and Eliza had expected it. Not because the old woman was mean. She wasn't mean exactly. She was guarded, and there was a difference. Martha Mercer had lived long enough to watch people come and go from this place, and every time someone came and then went, it left a mark. Eliza could read it in her, the way she held herself at a slight remove, the way she phrased things as observations rather than questions, the way she watched without letting herself be caught watching. On the fourth day, Eliza was in the kitchen filling the water basin when Martha came in moving slowly and holding one arm slightly tucked against her side. She didn't say anything, just eased herself into the chair at the table and sat very still in a way that wasn't her normal stillness. "Your shoulder?" Eliza said. Martha looked at her sharply. "My shoulder is fine." "Okay." She filled the basin and went back outside. But she came back inside 20 minutes later with a small cloth pouch she'd found in the barn, dried comfrey, which the previous hired hand had apparently kept for the horses. She set it on the table without saying anything, along with a strip of clean cloth. Martha looked at the cloth pouch. "What's this?" "For a poultice, if you wanted one." Eliza shrugged. "It's what my mother used to use." Martha was quiet for a moment. "Your mother worked ranches too?" "She cooked and kept house. My father worked the ranch. I was somewhere in between." A small pause. "I followed him more than her, I suppose." Martha picked up the cloth pouch and turned it over in her fingers, smelling it. "Comfrey." "Yes, ma'am. I know what comfrey is." But she didn't put it back down. Eliza left her to it and went back outside. That evening, Martha came to supper without the careful, stiff way she'd been holding herself all day. She didn't mention the poultice. Eliza didn't either. Tasam. The cattle situation took her the better part of 2 days to sort out. The south pasture was overworked. The grass there was short and patchy, and the herd had been on it too long. The east field had good growth and an existing water access from the creek if you opened the right gate, but the gate had been tied shut with wire and hadn't been opened in so long the wire had rusted into the post. Eliza found Caleb near the barn and told him what she'd found. "I know the east field's better," he said. "The gate gave me trouble last year, and I just got into the habit of the south pasture." "The south pasture's not going to recover if you don't rest it," she said. 6 weeks at least, ideally 8. "And if I move them to the east field?" "You've got better grass and water access. The fence line over there is in better shape too." She paused. "I can cut the wire on that gate and get it working again. Take about an hour." He rubbed the back of his neck. This was a thing he did when he was processing something. She'd noticed it by day 2. "All right," he said. "Yeah, do that." Getting the gate open took closer to 2 hours because the wire had corroded worse than she'd expected, and she cut her palm on a loose end halfway through. Not bad, just a long, shallow scrape that bled more than it hurt. She tied it with a strip from her shirt hem and kept going. By the time she had the gate open and swinging clean, her hand had stopped bleeding and the afternoon light was going golden and long across the field. She moved the herd herself, mostly, which was harder than it would have been with a second hand, but not impossible if you knew how to position yourself and how to read. Which animal was the natural follower leader of the group? Caleb appeared about halfway through and took up a position on the far side without being asked, and between the two of them they had the cattle in the east field and the gate secured before dark. Caleb looked at her hand when she latched the gate. "You cut yourself." "It's nothing. Let me see it." She showed him. The scrape had closed over, but it was red and raised at the edges, the kind of thing that would be stiff in the morning. "Come up to the house when we're done," he said. "Martha keeps a salve for that sort of thing." He said it practically, the way you say, "Hand me that wrench," without fuss, without making it something it wasn't. She appreciated that more than he probably knew. Thought. Martha was on the porch when they came up from the field, sitting in the chair she kept there, her hands in her lap. She watched them come through the yard gate, and her eyes stopped on Eliza's hand. "Wire cut," Caleb told her. Martha pushed herself up from the chair with the careful deliberateness she always used and went inside without a word. She came back with a tin of salve and set it on the porch railing and nodded at Eliza's hand. Eliza unwrapped the strip from her shirt hem, and Martha looked at the cut, then took Eliza's hand in both of hers, dry, bony hands with a grip that was still surprisingly firm, and worked the salve in with her thumbs without speaking. It stung, and Eliza didn't flinch, and Martha noticed that she didn't flinch. Something passed between them in the silence. Nothing said, nothing that could be said, but something registered and filed away on both sides. "You should wear gloves for wire work," Martha said finally, still holding her hand. "I know, I left mine at the last place." She'd left in a hurry. That was a longer story. Martha looked up at her, just briefly. Then she let go of her hand and picked up the tin of salve and went back inside. The screen door banged shut behind her. Caleb was leaning against the porch post, watching. He had an expression she couldn't fully read. Something thoughtful in it. Something that had been sitting with him a while. "She hasn't done that for anyone but family," he said quietly. Eliza looked at her hand. The salve was cool and smelled faintly of pine. Maybe she was just being practical. "Maybe," he said. He didn't sound like he believed it. The end of the trial week came and went without either of them formally marking it. Eliza had expected, or half expected, that Caleb would come to her on the 7th morning and either make it formal or tell her politely that he couldn't manage the wages. Instead, the 7th morning looked like the 6th, and the 6th had looked like the 5th. She was in the barn at first light. He came in after her. They worked. It was around mid-morning of the 8th day when they were replacing the 2 loose fence posts in the north line that he said, without looking up from the post he was tamping, "I can offer you $8 a month to start. I know it's not much." Eliza drove her tamper down around the base of her post. "It's fair enough. If the fall season's better, if the cattle prices hold, I'd like to do better than that." "I understand." She paused, tested the post. Solid. "It stays between us what you're paying me, if that matters to you." He looked over at her. "Why would I care about that?" "Some men do. They don't like the idea of people knowing what they pay a woman for ranch work. Makes them feel like it says something about the operation." Caleb was quiet for a second. "Does it bother you? The way some men are about it?" She thought about Deeks at the Carver place. The apologetic voice, the way he'd said it causes problems. She thought about Pruitt and his silk vest and his knowing smile. "It bothers me," she said. "I just don't let it stop me." He went back to his post. "Good," he said. "Just that. Good." What changed between Eliza and Martha didn't happen in a single moment. It happened the way most real things happen. Slowly, in pieces, without announcement. It was in the way Martha started leaving a cup of coffee on the kitchen table at the time she knew Eliza came in before dawn. She never said she was doing it. The cup was just there. It was in the afternoon when the old woman came into the barn while Eliza was working, moving slower than usual, something deliberate in her pace, and sat on the old hay bale near the door and just watched. Didn't speak for a long time, then said, out of nowhere, "Caleb's mother left when he was 9. Did he tell you that?" Eliza kept working, not wanting to make the moment too large. "No. Just left. Rode off one morning. He was the one who found her note." Martha paused. "He burned it. He was 9 years old and he picked up that note and walked it to the stove and put it in himself. Never said a word to me about what it said." The barn was very quiet. "That's why he works the way he does," Martha said. "Like if he stops, something will fall apart." Eliza set down her brush and looked at the old woman. "Did it? Fall apart, I mean." Martha considered this. "Parts of it." She shifted on the hay bale. "But parts didn't. That's the thing nobody ever tells you, Bess. Some things break and some things don't, and you can't always tell in advance which is which." Eliza thought about her own father's ranch, the mortgage that had caught up with them when she was 16, the auction, the feeling of watching strangers walk through rooms she'd grown up in. She thought about the way she'd stood at the gate watching the new owner's wagon come up the road, and how she'd promised herself she wouldn't cry, and how she hadn't. "No," she said. "You can't tell in advance." Martha looked at her with those gray-blue eyes. "You've lost something, too." It wasn't a question. "A few things," Eliza said. Martha nodded slowly, as if this was information that settled something inside her. "Caleb needs people who understand that," she said. "He's had enough of people who think you can just—" She waved a hand. "Start over clean, like nothing weighs anything." She pushed herself up off the hay bale, steadying herself with a hand against the barn wall. "The coffee will be cold if you don't come in soon," she said, and walked back out into the yard, leaving Eliza standing in the barn with the sounds of the horses around her and something in her chest that felt different than it had when the day started. She stood there for a moment, then she picked up the brush again, because the work wasn't done. It never was. Outside, the east field grass was growing back green and heavy in the late afternoon light, and the cattle moved through it slow and steady, the way cattle do when they have enough room and enough to eat. The bay mare was in the near paddock, weight balanced evenly on all four legs, ears turning at small sounds. The pump ran clear, the fence posts held. It wasn't a perfect place. The barn still needed paint, the money was still tight, and there were mornings when the whole enterprise felt like it was one bad season away from coming undone. But there was something here that hadn't been here 6 weeks ago. Some quality in the air of the place that was harder to name than a fence post or a water line, but just as necessary. Eliza went in for the coffee before it got cold. The trouble didn't arrive all at once. It crept in the way bad weather does on the plains. First a distant darkening on the horizon that you tell yourself is nothing, then a shift in the wind that makes the horses uneasy, and then suddenly the sky is the wrong color and you're running for cover, wondering how you missed the signs. It started, as these things often do, with a woman who meant no particular harm. Her name was Dora Phelps, and she ran the post office in Harlan Creek with the quiet authority of someone who understood that information was its own kind of currency. She wasn't a cruel woman. She was simply a woman who found silence uncomfortable and conversation irresistible, and who had perhaps never fully understood where the line sat between sharing news and spreading damage. Eliza had been at the Mercer Ranch for 6 weeks when she first rode into town with Caleb to pick up supplies. It was a practical arrangement. The wagon needed 2 people to load properly, and Caleb had 3 months' worth of errands backed up. They went on a Thursday morning, worked their way through the general store and the feed supply, and stopped at the post office for a package Martha was expecting. Dora Phelps was behind the counter when they came in. She was a round-faced woman in her 50s with quick eyes and a pleasant enough manner, and she looked at Caleb and then at Eliza and then back at Caleb with an expression that was carefully neutral in the way that careful neutrality never actually is. "Caleb," she said, "didn't know you had a... Is this a relative?" "Ranch hand," Caleb said. "Martha's package come in?" It did, but Dora didn't move to get it immediately. "Ranch hand," she repeated with a slight uptick at the end that turned it into something between a statement and a question. "Well, I didn't know you were hiring. Needed the help." "Of course." She smiled at Eliza. "And you're living out at the Mercer place then?" "Tack room," Eliza said. "Of course," Dora said again in the exact same tone. She got the package. The transaction was finished in under 2 minutes. But on the way out, Eliza felt the weight of those 2 minutes sitting on her shoulders in a way she recognized from experience and didn't like. "She's going to talk," she said to Caleb once they were back at the wagon. He loaded a sack of flour without looking up. "Dora talks about everything. This is different, and you know it." He straightened up and looked at her. He had that expression he got when something uncomfortable was true, and he was deciding how honest to be about it. "Yeah," he said finally, "I know it." They drove back to the ranch mostly quiet, and neither of them brought it up again that day. But it sat there, between them and around them, the way uncomfortable truths do when you decide to leave them on the table instead of dealing with them. By the end of the second week after that trip to town, Eliza could feel the shift. It wasn't anything she could point to directly, a look here, a pause there. When she rode into Harlan Creek alone to pick up a part for the pump, the conversation at the feed supply stopped a half-beat too long when she walked in. The man behind the counter, a heavy-set fellow named Roy, who had always been perfectly polite before, was still polite. But there was something performed about it now, something that hadn't been there 6 weeks ago. On her way back out, she passed 2 women on the board sidewalk outside the general store. She didn't know their names. She nodded. One of them nodded back. The other looked away and then leaned toward her companion as Eliza passed, and Eliza didn't hear what was said, but she didn't need to. She rode back to the ranch with the pump part in her saddlebag and a cold, settled feeling in her stomach. That evening, Caleb came in from town himself. He'd gone back in the afternoon for something she hadn't been with him for, and he was quiet at supper in a way that was different from his usual quiet. His usual quiet was comfortable. This one had edges. Martha watched him all through supper and didn't say anything until the plates were cleared. Then she said, "What happened in town?" It wasn't a question. Caleb turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Ran into Gerald Marsh at the feed supply." Martha's face changed slightly. "What did Gerald say?" "He was—" Caleb stopped. "He was asking questions about the ranch, about the loan." He set the cup down. "About Eliza." Eliza kept her face still. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that aren't really questions." He looked at her directly, which she appreciated even though she didn't like what was coming. He said there's talk that a single woman living on a man's property without proper arrangements, it's not sitting right with some people. The kitchen was very quiet. "Proper arrangements," Eliza said. "That's what he said." "And what did you say?" "I told him Eliza Whitmore is a ranch hand and that it was none of his concern." He said it flatly, without drama, and she believed him. "But Gerald Marsh is on the board of the Harlan Creek Savings and Loan." There it was. Martha made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "The loan," Eliza said. "The loan comes up for renewal in 8 weeks." He wasn't looking at her now, looking somewhere at the middle of the table. Marsh implied, he didn't say it outright, but he implied bewildered that the board would be looking closely at the operation's stability and its reputation. The word landed in the room like something dropped. Eliza thought about the Mercer land, 3 miles south of Harlan Creek, the fence line that was finally holding, the east field full of cattle getting fat on good grass, the pump running clean. She thought about what it had taken Caleb's family to hold on to it, what it was worth to him, to Martha. She thought about how easily it could be undone. "I see," she said. "I'm not telling you this to—" Caleb started. "I know why you're telling me." She looked at him. "You're telling me because it's fair that I know, because it affects me too." She paused. "And because you're not sure what to do about it." He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. Martha pushed back from the table. She moved to the window and stood there looking out at the dark yard, and her back was very straight in that deliberate way of hers. "People in this town," she said, to the window, "have had something to say about this family since before Caleb was born. They had things to say when his father bought this land. They had things to say when his mother left." She paused. "I have spent 40 years deciding which things to fight and which things to let blow past." "Martha," Caleb began. "I'm not finished." She turned around. Her gray-blue eyes moved between Caleb and Eliza. "Gerald Marsh is a small man with a small mind and a large amount of authority, and that is a genuinely dangerous combination. I won't pretend otherwise." She sat back down slowly. "But this land has been in this family for 32 years, and I will not let gossip take what drought and hard winters couldn't." It was the most Eliza had ever heard her say at once. The three of them sat with it for a minute. Then Caleb looked at Eliza. "We need to talk about what happens if—" "Not tonight," Martha said, with the authority of someone who has learned that some conversations need at least a night of sleep before they can be had without people saying things they'll regret. "Tonight we finish our coffee and we go to bed. Tomorrow is tomorrow." Eliza lay on the cot in the tack room that night and looked at the ceiling and did not sleep for a long time. She had been here before, in different forms, not the specific geography of it, not the specific people, but the underlying shape of it. The moment when you realize that existing in a place is not the same as being allowed to exist in a place. That the ground you've been standing on has always had conditions attached that nobody told you about up front. She thought about Dora Phelps and her carefully neutral expression. She thought about Gerald Marsh and his implications. She thought about the women on the sidewalk and the conversation she hadn't heard but could have written herself, word for word. She had not done anything wrong. She had worked hard, kept to herself, done right by the ranch and the people on it. None of that mattered to the people talking about her in town, because the thing they objected to had nothing to do with what she'd done or hadn't done. It had to do with what she was, a woman living in a man's space outside the specific container that society had built for women like her, And the mere fact of that was enough. The worst part wasn't the injustice of it. She had made a kind of peace with injustice years ago. Not acceptance, but a working understanding of it. The worst part was the thought of what it might cost Caleb. She turned onto her side and listened to the horses breathing in their stalls on the other side of the wall. She was still awake when the sky outside the small ceiling window started going gray. The next 3 weeks were hard in a particular way that was different from the physical heart of ranch work. Eliza went into town twice more during that period, and each time the atmosphere had thickened slightly. A woman named Hensley, wife of one of the church deacons, made a pointed comment at the general store about the importance of propriety in frontier communities, not quite looking at Eliza while she said it, but not quite not looking either. A group of men outside the saloon went quiet when Eliza rode past and then started talking again loudly about nothing, which was somehow worse than if they'd said something directly. She told Caleb about the Hensley comment when she got back that day. Not all of it, just the shape of it. He listened with his jaw set in the way it got when something made him angry, but he was controlling it. "Ignore her," he said. "I'm good at ignoring things," Eliza said. "I'm less good at ignoring the effect those things have on your loan situation." He didn't have an answer for that. It was on a Wednesday, 5 weeks after the first trip to town with Caleb, that Gerald Marsh came to the ranch. Eliza was in the north pasture checking the fence line when she saw the buggy coming up the road. A good buggy, well kept, the kind of vehicle a man drives when he wants to make sure you notice the difference between his circumstances and yours. She watched it turn up the lane to the Mercer house and felt the cold things settle in her stomach again. She finished the section of fence she was checking, because leaving a job half done was a habit she refused to let anxiety create in her, and then walked back to the yard. Marsh was on the porch with Caleb by the time she got there. He was a tall man, older, with the kind of silver hair that looks distinguished and the kind of chin that looks used to being deferred to. He was speaking in the careful, measured voice of a man who has practiced saying difficult things in ways that make them sound reasonable. "Not a question of personal character," he was saying as Eliza came through the yard gate. "I want to be clear about that. It's a question of how the situation looks to the community, and how that reflects on the soundness of the operation." Caleb saw Eliza and something shifted in his face, a slight tensing, not alarm exactly, but the look of a man who knows things are about to get more complicated. Marsh turned and saw her too. He nodded. "Miss Whitmore." "Mr. Marsh." She stopped at the foot of the porch steps. She didn't go up. There was a brief silence in which everyone was aware of exactly what was being decided without saying so. "I was just explaining to Caleb," Marsh said, with the patient tone of someone explaining something to people slower than themselves, "that the board has some concerns about the loan renewal. We want to ensure the operations we support reflect the values of this community." "The values of this community," Eliza said. "That's right. And those values include—" She kept her voice even. "What exactly?" Marsh looked at her the way men like him look at women who ask direct questions. A fraction of a second of surprise, quickly covered. "Proper household arrangements, a stable family situation, things that indicate stability," Eliza finished for him. "Yes." "So a man working a struggling ranch alone with an aging grandmother he can barely get help for, that's stable." She said it without heat, almost conversationally. "But the same ranch, running better than it has in years, with a hired hand who knows the work, that's a concern." Marsh's jaw tightened slightly. "Miss Whitmore, I don't think you fully understand the nature of—" "I think I understand it fine," she said. "I just disagree with it." There was a silence. Caleb was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something in it that wasn't quite warning and wasn't quite gratitude. Marsh cleared his throat. "Caleb, the loan renewal date is 6 weeks away. I strongly suggest you give serious thought to how you want to handle this." He reached into his jacket and produced a card, set it on the porch railing. "Come see me when you've had time to think." He looked at Eliza once more, briefly, without hostility, which was almost worse somehow, and walked back to his buggy. They watched him drive away. The dust settled behind the buggy wheels, and then, There was just the ranch, the same as it had been an hour ago. The fence lines holding, the cattle in the east pasture, the pump running clean, and the loan renewal sitting over all of it like a cloud that had moved between the sun and the ground. Caleb picked up the card Marsh had left on the railing and looked at it. "I could talk to the bank in Miller County," he said. "Try to refinance." "Would they take you?" "Maybe. Probably at worse terms." He set the card back down. "Or I could—" He stopped. Eliza waited. He turned to look at her, and there was something in his face that he was clearly working up to saying, something that had been sitting in him for a while. And whatever it was, the arrival of Gerald Marsh had pushed it forward in time. But he didn't say it. Instead, he said, "I need to think." "All right," she said. She went back to the fence line. It was Martha who came to find her that evening. Not in the barn, not in the kitchen. Martha came out across the yard in the fading light, moving carefully on the uneven ground, and found Eliza sitting on the fence rail of the near paddock watching the horses. It was the end of the day, and the light was going copper and long, and the bay mare was grazing near the far fence, healthy and easy, nothing like the painful stillness she'd been holding the day Eliza arrived. Martha came up and stood beside the fence and didn't say anything for a minute. Then she said, "You're thinking about leaving." It wasn't an accusation. It was quiet and said without drama, and it was accurate. Eliza looked at the horses. "I've been thinking about it. Because of the loan. Because of what I'm costing him." She kept her eyes on the mare. "The operation is better than it was. He knows it. You know it. But if the bank won't renew because of how things look with me here, then the operation doesn't matter. The land goes and everything on it, and that's worse than where he was before I came." Martha was quiet for a moment. "That's a very practical way to think about it. I'm a practical person." "I know you are." Martha put both hands on the top fence rail. Her knuckles were swollen at the joints, the way old hands get. "I want to tell you something. I want you to actually listen, not just wait for me to finish so you can go back to your practical thinking." Eliza looked at her then. "I have spent a very long time in this place," Martha said. 32 years on this land. I buried my son here." A pause. "I raised Caleb here. I watched people come and work and leave, and I watched the land take everything we had and give back just enough to make us stay." She turned her gray-blue eyes on Eliza. "You are the first person in all of that time who has walked into this place and made it feel like it had a future." Eliza didn't say anything. She wasn't sure she could. "Not because of the fence posts," Martha said. "Not because of the east pasture or the pump or any of the practical things, though Lord knows those matter. It's something else." She paused, searching for the word. "It's that when you're here, Caleb doesn't look like a man waiting for something to fail. He looks like a man building something." The copper light was going, the sky darkening at the edges. "If you leave because of Gerald Marsh and his small ideas," Martha said, "you will be letting the wrong people decide what happens to this family, and I have had enough of the wrong people deciding things." Her voice didn't rise. It hardened, which was somehow more significant. "I didn't fight 32 years on this land to hand it over to gossip." Eliza sat with that. "It's not just gossip," she said finally. "It's the loan." "I know what it is." Martha straightened up from the fence slowly. "And I am telling you that we are going to deal with it together." She said the last word with a deliberateness that made it mean more than it would have coming from anyone else. "All three of us." She turned and walked back across the yard toward the house, careful on the uneven ground, her back straight in that way she maintained through effort and stubbornness and whatever else it took. Eliza sat on the fence rail and watched her go. In the paddock, the bay mare lifted her head from the grass and looked at Eliza for a moment, dark eyes, steady and calm, and then went back to grazing. The night came on slow and soft, the stars beginning to show at the edges of the sky. The land was very still. Out in the east pasture, one of the cattle lowed once, low and distant, and was answered by another, and then the quiet came back and sat over everything like something that had been there a long time and planned to stay. And Eliza said the cattle would need checking in the morning if there was rain. It was ordinary conversation, the kind that fills space while something larger gets worked out underneath. And all three of them knew it and let it happen anyway, because sometimes you need a night of ordinary before you can face the extraordinary. But in the morning, Caleb was already up when Eliza came in from the barn. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of him and a pen in his hand, and he had the look of a man who had been awake for hours working something through to its conclusion. Martha was at the stove. The coffee was already made. "Sit down," he said when Eliza came in. She sat. He looked at the paper, then at her. "There's a community meeting at the hall in Harlan Creek. They hold them the first Friday of every month. Town business, disputes, that kind of thing. Anyone can request time to speak." He paused. "The next one is in 4 days." Martha set a cup of coffee in front of Eliza without being asked. "I want to request time," Caleb said. "I want to put this in front of the community directly. The rumors, the loan pressure, all of it. I want to bring it into the open where it has to be what it actually is instead of what people whisper it is." Eliza looked at him. "That's a significant risk." "I know it is." "If it goes badly, you've made it public. You can't take it back." "I know that too." He set the pen down. "But Gerald Marsh came to my property and told me, in polite language, that I need to make you leave or arrange things differently, or he'll put pressure on my loan. And I've been sitting with that for 16 hours, and every way I look at it, what he's doing is wrong. Not just inconvenient, wrong." He said the last word plainly, without raising his voice, which made it more definitive than if he'd shouted it. "And I'm tired of letting wrong things happen quietly." The kitchen was still. Martha turned from the stove and looked at her grandson with an expression Eliza had not seen on her face before. Something that was beyond pride. Something that had older and more complicated roots than that. She didn't say anything. She turned back to the stove. Eliza looked at the piece of paper on the table. "What are you going to say to them?" "The truth," Caleb said, "about the ranch, about what it was before you got here, and what it is now, about the loan and Marsh's visit, and what he implied." He met her eyes. "And I'd like you to speak too, if you're willing." She had not planned to speak publicly in front of a town that had already decided what it thought of her. She had not planned most of what had happened to her in the last 8 weeks, if she was honest about it. "All right," she said. He nodded. There was something in his face that relaxed slightly, the way a face does when something it's been braced for doesn't turn out to require as much bracing as expected. "I'll write the request today," he said. The 4 days between that morning and the community meeting were some of the strangest Eliza had experienced at the ranch. The work continued as it always did. The cattle still needed tending, the horses still needed feeding, the fence line still required checking after the rain that had come through on Thursday and softened the ground around 2 of the posts they'd set. She and Caleb worked side by side in the way they'd settled into over the past 2 months, the easy, wordless rhythm of 2 people who understood each other's pace. But there was something different in it now, a kind of heightened quality, like the air before a storm when everything is clear and still and the light has that particular flat sharpness to it. Eliza noticed that Caleb talked a little less than usual, which wasn't easy given that he didn't talk a great deal to begin with. Martha moved through the house with unusual deliberateness, as if she were conserving something. On Thursday evening, the night before the meeting, Martha came to the tack room. She knocked, which was something she had never done before, always just called from the barn door or waited for Eliza to come to the house. Eliza opened the door and found her standing there with something folded over her arm. "This was mine," Martha said, "a long time ago." She held it out. It was a dress, dark blue, simply cut, well made, the kind of clothes a woman wears when she wants to be taken seriously. It had been carefully kept, folded along old creases. Eliza looked at it. "Martha, you're about the same height I was," Martha said, practically, in the tone she used when she wanted to forestall sentiment. "You'll need to let out the waist a little. There's extra seam allowance, and it'll need pressing." She set it over Eliza's arm. "You can wear what you want. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just—" She stopped. "I want them to see you clearly, not give them anything to talk about that isn't the point." Eliza held the dress and looked at the old woman in the doorway. "Thank you," she said. Martha gave a short nod. "The iron's on the shelf in the kitchen. Don't let it get too hot, or the fabric will mark." She turned to go, then stopped. "You know what you're going to say tomorrow?" I'm working on it. Martha looked at her over her shoulder. Don't apologize, she said. Not for a single thing. Whatever else you do, don't apologize. She went back across the yard to the house. Eliza stood in the tack room doorway, holding the blue dress and listening to the night sounds. Crickets, a distant owl, the slow movement of horses in their stalls, and thought about what it meant that a woman who had spent most of her life keeping people at a careful distance had come to her door on the night before a hard day and given her something that had once meant something. She pressed the dress and took in the waist seam by feel and sat up too late and was still awake when the sky started going gray. The Harlan Creek Community Hall was a long rectangular building at the north end of Main Street, built from the same weathered timber as most everything else in town, with 2 rows of benches inside and a raised platform at the front that served as the speaking area for meetings, occasional church overflow, and once, according to Martha, a traveling theater company that had performed a version of Hamlet in which the ghost was played by the same actor as Claudius due to a casting shortage. By the time Caleb pulled the wagon up outside, the hall was more than half full. That surprised him. He could see it in the slight hesitation before he set the brake. Community meetings in Harlan Creek usually drew the same committed 20 or 30 people who showed up to everything. There were at least twice that many here tonight, and more coming up the street from both directions. Word got out, Martha said from the wagon seat beside him. About what we're doing here? About what you're doing here. She looked at the crowd moving toward the hall entrance. People find out a man is going to say something uncomfortable in public. They want to see it. Eliza was in the back of the wagon. She'd ridden there rather than on the bench, which had felt right somehow. She was not presenting herself as Caleb's guest or companion. She was going on her own terms. She had on the blue dress. Her boots were the same worn ones, resoled as best she'd been able to manage with materials from the barn, but clean. She had her hair pinned up, which she rarely did, not because she'd been told to, but because it was a practical choice for keeping her face visible when she needed people to look at her directly. She climbed down from the wagon without help and straightened the dress and looked at the hall. Let's go, she said. Inside, the noise was the low, steady hum of a crowd that was talking, but not yet about what it had come to talk about. Eliza walked in behind Caleb and Martha and felt the room adjust when they entered. Not a silence, but a shift in frequency, the way a room's sound changes when the thing it's been anticipating actually arrives. She recognized some faces. Dora Phelps from the post office, near the left wall, with 2 women beside her that Eliza didn't know. Roy from the feed supply, toward the back, who looked somewhere between curious and uncomfortable. The deacon's wife, Mrs. Hensley, in the 3rd row, sitting very straight and looking at Eliza with an expression of tight, organized disapproval. Gerald Marsh was at the front, slightly to the side of the platform, talking to another man in a good suit who had the look of someone whose opinion of himself was his most developed quality. When Marsh saw Caleb, he nodded, careful, cordial, the nod of a man who believes the social form should be observed regardless of the content being transacted beneath them. Caleb nodded back. He and Marsh would always be civil to each other, Eliza understood. Men like Caleb and men like Marsh coexisted in these communities by maintaining a surface decorum over everything else. It was only the terms underneath that were being contested. The meeting was called to order by a man named Horace Webb, who served as some sort of unofficial civic moderator, a lean older man with an unhurried manner and the air of someone who has chaired enough community meetings to have lost his fear of awkward silences. He worked through 2 pieces of ordinary business first, a question about a disputed property line near the schoolhouse, and a proposal about road maintenance on the eastern track. And then he looked at his paper and said, "Next, we have a request from Caleb Mercer for the floor." "Caleb?" Caleb stood up from the bench and walked to the platform. He was not a natural public speaker. He was a man more comfortable with fence posts and water lines than with words in front of a crowd. And it showed. He stood slightly awkwardly at first, his hands not sure what to do. But then he set them flat on the railing in front of him and looked out at the room, and whatever discomfort was in his body, his voice, when it came, was steady. "Most of you know me," he said. "Some of you have known my family for 30 years. You know this ranch has been through hard stretches." He paused. "About 2 months ago, I hired a ranch hand named Eliza Whitmore. Some of you have met her. Most of you have heard about her. He let that sit for a moment. What I'm here to tell you tonight is what's actually happened at the Mercer place since she came to work there, because I think there's some distance between what people have been hearing and what's true. The room was quiet now. The kind of quiet that happens when people realize they're not watching something collapse but something being built, and they're not sure how they feel about that. He talked about the cattle rotation, the pump, the fence work, the hay yield projections for fall, which were better than they'd been in 3 years. He talked about the loan and about the visit from Gerald Marsh, and to his credit, he didn't name it as an accusation, but as a fact, that a board member had come to his property and indicated that the loan renewal was connected to the presence of a female ranch hand on the property, and that he found this connection to be without merit and wished to say so publicly. Marsh, in his seat to the side, maintained his composed expression throughout. He was not a man who could easily be rattled, which Eliza had understood from the moment she'd seen him step down from his buggy 3 weeks ago. When Caleb finished, there was a moment of silence, and then Horace Webb said, "Miss Whitmore, I understand you also requested a few minutes." She stood. She walked to the platform without hurrying. She was aware of the room watching her, aware of Mrs. Hensley's expression, of Dora Phelps leaning slightly forward, of a dozen other faces she had catalogued in the moment she walked in. She was aware of Martha, very straight on the bench in the second row, watching with those gray-blue eyes and that expression of deliberate stillness that was not calm but something that had survived a long time and knew how to do it. She stood at the railing and looked out at the room. "I've been told all my life what I can't do," she said. She didn't pitch her voice loudly. The room was quiet enough that she didn't need to. "I've been told I'm not strong enough, not suitable, not appropriate. I've been told that the work I know how to do is not for women, and the places I can do it are not for women, and that if I insist on doing it anyway, I cause problems for everyone around me." She paused. "I've heard that said in 4 towns in the last 2 months alone." A few people shifted on the benches. "I'm not here to argue about whether that's fair," she said. "You already know whether it's fair. I think most people in this room, if they sat with it honestly, know the answer to that question." She looked along the rows, not challenging, just looking, making contact. "What I'm here to say is what I told Caleb Mercer the day I arrived, which is the truth about what I am. I'm a ranch hand. I've worked cattle since I was old enough to be useful. I know horses and fencing and water management and livestock medicine and about 15 other things that a working ranch needs. I'm not looking for anyone's approval of the fact that I know those things. I'm looking to work." She stopped for a moment. "I came to Harlan Creek because I needed work and I found it. The Mercer Ranch needed someone who knew what they were doing, and I fit that need. That is the whole of it." She stepped back from the railing. She had almost sat down when she stopped herself. There was one more thing, and Martha's voice was in her head. "Don't apologize." And she wasn't going to, but there was something else that needed saying. "I know what people have been saying about why I'm there," she said. "I know what's been implied about the arrangement and about my character. I'm not going to defend myself against that because there's nothing to defend against. But I will say this. The Mercer Ranch is not just a piece of land to those people. It's 32 years of one family's work and grief and holding on. Martha Mercer has given more to that ground than most people give to anything in a lifetime. And what is happening to that family's loan because of rumors about me is not a property matter. It's a cruelty." She let that land. "I thought someone should call it by its right name." She walked back to the bench and sat down. The hall was very quiet. It was Horace Webb who spoke first, and he did so carefully, in the measured tone of a man who has learned to read a room. "Gerald, I suspect you'll want to respond to some of what's been said." Marsh rose from his seat with his usual composed efficiency. He was good at this, at making his position sound reasonable, at framing disagreement as concern. He talked about community standards and the board's responsibilities and the importance of consistent policy. He was not cruel about it. He was precise and civil and entirely, absolutely wrong. And the longer he spoke, the more the room seemed to understand that. In the particular way that the truth of a thing sometimes becomes clearer, the more carefully someone tries to obscure it. When he finished, there was a silence. And then, from the back of the room, a man stood up. Eliza did not know him by name, but she recognized him. The day she had walked to Caleb's ranch, the very first day she had passed the Carver operation and been turned down by a foreman. This was not that foreman. This was a man she'd seen on her walk between towns, working a fence line near the road at the Carver spread. He was weather-beaten and solid, and had the look of a man who chose his words the same way he chose his tools, not many and not without purpose. "My name is Dan Fremont," he said, to the room rather than to anyone in particular. "I've worked the Carver operation going on 6 years. I was there the day this woman walked up looking for work." He paused. Deeks turned her away. "You all know Deeks. He's a fair man and he knows his business." He turned her away because that's the way it's done, not because she didn't know her work. He stopped again, and something moved across his weathered face that looked like the specific discomfort of a man about to say a thing he'd been sitting on for a while. "I watched her walk up and make her case, and I watched her walk away when she got turned down. And I've thought about that day more than I'd expect to. Because she didn't argue, she didn't make a scene. She just said her piece and turned around and kept going." He looked down at his hat and his hands. "I've known men who couldn't take a setback that clean." He sat back down. The silence after that was different from the one before it. Across the room, Dora Phelps was looking at the floor. Mrs. Hensley had the expression of a woman whose certainty was not broken, but had developed a crack she was trying not to show. Roy from the feed supply was nodding slowly to himself, the way people do when something settles something for them. Horace Webb let the silence run for a few more seconds than was comfortable. Then he said, "I think we've heard enough for tonight. Gerald, I'd suggest the board revisit the Mercer loan renewal on its own merits. The rest of it," he looked at the room, "I'll leave to everyone's conscience." It wasn't a verdict. It wasn't a ruling. It was an old man with an unhurried manner declining to make things tidy. And in this particular room, on this particular night, it was enough. They walked out into the night air, the three of them, and for a moment they just stood on the board sidewalk outside the community hall and let the night settle around them. People came out of the hall and moved past. Some nodded at Caleb. One man clapped him briefly on the shoulder without saying anything. A woman Eliza didn't know met her eyes and held the look for a moment in a way that meant something, even if Eliza couldn't have said precisely what. Gerald Marsh came out and paused near them. He looked at Caleb. "I'll discuss the loan review with the board," he said. Just that. He walked to his buggy. Martha watched him go. "That's as close to backing down as that man gets," she said. "I know," Caleb said. They stood there another minute. The night was cool and the stars were out, and Main Street was quiet now, most of the town having dispersed in the particular way people disperse after a public event, quickly, before they have to look too closely at each other. Eliza looked at the street and at the sky above it and at the building they'd just walked out of, and she thought about all the miles she had walked to get here, the cracked boots and the 63 cents and the foreman who hadn't bothered to hear her out and the town sidewalks where women whispered about her as she passed. She thought about the piece of flint she'd set on Caleb's fence rail on the first day. She thought about Martha's hands on hers, working salve into the wire cut, and the cup of coffee left on the kitchen table before dawn, and the blue dress folded over an old woman's arm at the tack room door. She had not asked for any of this. She had not planned it. She had asked for honest work and honest pay, and what she'd gotten was larger and more complicated than that, the way things tend to be when you walk far enough in one direction and finally stop walking. "We should get back," she said. "The bay mare needs checking before bed." "She's fine," Caleb said. "She might be fine." "I'd rather know than assume." Martha made a sound that was probably the closest she came to a laugh in most circumstances. She moved toward the wagon. "The girl's right. Let's go home." The wagon rolled out of Harlan Creek with the three of them on the bench together. Martha, in the middle, which was not how they'd come in, and nobody commented on it, and the sound of the horses on the road and the dark plains opening up around them, and behind them the yellow lights of town getting smaller, and ahead of them the darker dark of the land they'd come from. Eliza looked out at the passing dark and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a thing that was too plain and too ordinary to have a dramatic name. Just the specific quiet of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be, in this moment, on this road, in this particular life. It lasted about 30 seconds before Martha said, "You left the kitchen window unlatched again." And the spell broke the way spells do, messily and completely. And Eliza said she'd latched it, and Martha said she hadn't, and Caleb said nothing, and kept his eyes on the road with the expression of a man who had learned when to stay out of things. The ranch was exactly as they'd left it, dark, solid, the pump silent, the horses moving softly behind the barn walls. The east pasture was a shape in the darkness, the cattle invisible but present, their slow sounds carrying on the night air. Eliza checked the bay mare, who was fine, as Caleb had said. She latched the tack room door and lay on the cot, and looked at the ceiling window and the stars through it, and did not have the answer to anything except that she was still here, and the morning would come, and there would be work. That was enough. The letter from the Harlan Creek Savings and Loan arrived on a Tuesday, 9 days after the community meeting. Caleb brought it in from the road and set it on the kitchen table without opening it, which told Eliza everything she needed to know about how much it was weighing on him. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter with his back to the table for a moment, the way a man stands when he's giving himself time before he has to know something. Martha came in from the sitting room and looked at the envelope on the table, and then at Caleb's back, and then at Eliza, who was sitting across the table with her hands around her own cup. "Open it," Martha said. "I will." "Open it now, Caleb. Standing there won't change what's in it." He turned around, picked up the envelope, and opened it. He read it standing up, which took about 30 seconds, and his face while he read it was the careful blank of someone who has learned not to let his expressions run ahead of his information. Then he set the letter on the table and pushed it toward the center. Eliza read it. Martha leaned over and read it beside her. The loan renewal had been approved, standard terms. No conditions attached beyond the standard repayment schedule. Gerald Marsh's name appeared nowhere in the letter. It was signed by the bank's administrative clerk, the kind of correspondence that was designed to look routine even when everything surrounding it had been anything but. Martha straightened up. She said nothing. She went back to the sitting room. Caleb picked the letter up, folded it, and put it in his shirt pocket. "Well," he said. "Well," Eliza agreed. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. Outside, the morning was already warm, the sky that deep midsummer blue that shows up in Kansas in late August when the heat has burned out whatever haze was sitting over everything. "I'm going to check the north fence this morning," Eliza said after a while. "There's a section near the creek bend I've been meaning to get to." "I'll take the creek bend." He nodded. She stood up and rinsed her cup and went out to the barn. And the morning went on the way mornings do when the thing you've been holding your breath against finally passes. Not with drama or relief exactly, but with the simple resumption of the ordinary, which is its own kind of grace. The weeks that followed were the most stable the Mercer Ranch had known in years. And stability, Eliza was learning, had its own particular texture. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't the sharp, specific urgency of crisis, the sick horse, the wire cut, the night before the community meeting when everything felt like it was balanced on a point. It was quieter than that, and in some ways harder to hold on to, because it didn't announce itself. But it was there in the numbers, which Caleb showed her one evening in early September. The cattle weights, the hay yield, the cost of supplies against what they'd brought in at the summer market. The numbers weren't triumphant. They didn't tell a story of sudden reversal or dramatic salvation. They told a story of a ranch that had stopped losing ground and started gaining it, slowly, a few dollars at a time. "If fall prices hold," Caleb said, going over the columns at the kitchen table, "we'll end the year better than we've started it in 8 years. The east pasture's going to be important come spring," Eliza said. "If we rotate back to the south section before April, we'll have enough recovery time for a decent summer yield." "I was thinking the same." He looked up. "You've thought further ahead on this than I have. You've been managing the money side. I've been managing the land side." She shrugged. "Between the two, you get the whole picture." He looked at her for a moment with something in his face she had noticed more often lately, not quite what she'd call longing, because that word carried a weight she wasn't ready to assign to it, but something that had more presence than the practical ease they'd settled into over months of shared work. Something that was aware of her in a way that went beyond the ranch. She had been aware of it. She had not addressed it because there was a version of this that ended badly. A woman in her position, with no money and no family nearby and no place else to go, could not afford to misread the situation, and she was not certain she wasn't misreading it. She looked back down at the columns of numbers. Patek. It was Martha, predictably, who said it out loud first. It was a Sunday afternoon in late September, one of those clear, cool days when the plains look like they've been cleaned, and Eliza was on the porch restitching a piece of harness leather that had cracked at the buckle. Martha came out and sat in her chair and did her Sunday thing of sitting and watching the yard and the land beyond it, which was her version of rest. They sat together in the kind of comfortable silence they'd developed over months. Then Martha said, without any particular preamble, "Caleb is not good at saying things." Eliza kept her eyes on the harness. "I've noticed. He gets it from his grandfather. Good man. Terrible at words." Martha folded her hands in her lap. "He thinks you don't know how he feels." "I have a sense of it." "Then why are you letting him flounder around about it?" Eliza looked up then. Martha was watching the yard, not looking at her, which was considerate in its own way. "Because I don't know what I want it to be," Eliza said, "and it's not fair to let someone say a thing they can't take back until you know." Martha was quiet for a moment. "That's more honest than most people are." "I try to be honest." "I know you do." Martha shifted in her chair, wincing slightly at whatever her shoulder was doing these days. "Can I say something else?" "You're going to regardless." The corner of Martha's mouth moved. "You came here with nothing, and you turned this place around. And somewhere in the middle of that, you decided that what you do and how well you do it is enough, that you don't need anything beyond the work." She paused. "That's how a person survives when they've been treated like a tool. You make yourself good enough that no one can justify getting rid of you." Eliza set the harness down slowly. "But that's different from belonging somewhere," Martha said, "and I think you know the difference. I think you've known it for a while, and you're afraid of it." The afternoon light lay long and quiet across the yard. One of the cats that lived in the barn was sitting in the dust near the gate, washing its face with complete self-absorption. "I've been let down before," Eliza said, "when I've let myself want something specific." "I know." Martha finally looked at her. "So have I. So has Caleb." Her gray-blue eyes were direct and clear in the afternoon light. "That doesn't mean you stop wanting things. It just means you choose carefully." She didn't say anything more. After a while, she went back inside, and Eliza picked up the harness and found she couldn't remember where she'd been in the stitching. It happened on a Thursday evening, which was not a romantic occasion by any reasonable measure. Eliza was coming in from the south pasture with mud on her boots from where the creek bank had given way under her, and Caleb was fixing the latch on the barn door that had been sticking all week, and the sun was going down in the characteristically spectacular way it does over the Kansas plains in October, that high burning orange that makes everything look like it's made of copper. He heard her coming and straightened up from the latch and looked at her, and she looked at him, and there was a moment. One of those moments that has been quietly gathering for a long time before it arrives, so that when it finally shows up, it feels both sudden and inevitable. "I need to say something," he said. "All right." He set the screwdriver down on the fence post. He was not good at this, and they both knew it, and he didn't try to pretend otherwise. Just stood there for a second with the slightly pained expression of a man doing something that doesn't come easy. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for about 6 weeks, he said, "and I've decided the problem is that I'm trying to find the right way to say it, and there probably isn't one, so I'm just going to say it plainly, and you can tell me where I've gotten it wrong." "That seems reasonable," she said. He looked at her. "I don't want you here because you're good at the work. You are good at the work. You're the best person I've ever had on this ranch, and that matters. But that's not why." He stopped, reorganized. "I want you here because this place is different when you're in it. I'm different when you're in it." He paused. "I've been alone a long time, not just by circumstance, and I got used to it. I made a kind of peace with the idea that this was going to be me and Martha and the ranch, and that was it." He looked down at his hands briefly, then back up. "And then you came up the road with your boot held together with a leather strip, and you pulled a piece of flint out of that mare's hoof like it was the most natural thing in the world, and I've been off balance since about 5 minutes after that." Eliza was quiet. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Not as a ranch hand, as—" He stopped again, and this time the stop was longer. "I'm asking you to build this thing with me, the ranch, and whatever else comes with it." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking you to marry me, Eliza, if that's something you'd want." The sun was still doing its thing over the plains, entirely indifferent to what was happening by the barn door. A horse moved somewhere behind the wall. The barn cat, which had followed Eliza in from the pasture for reasons of its own, sat near the gatepost and stared at nothing. Eliza looked at Caleb Mercer, at his tired, honest face and his hands that were never quite clean, and the way he stood, slightly braced, like a man ready to take a setback with dignity if that's what was coming. She thought about the road that had brought her here, every door that had closed, every town that had seen her as a problem to solve rather than a person to know. She thought about what it felt like to need something and be told, over and over, that she wasn't the kind of person who got to have it. She thought about Martha telling her don't apologize, and the cup of coffee left before dawn, and the blue dress folded over old hands. She thought about Caleb shaking her hand on the first day, firm and brief, like she was a person deserving of that ordinary dignity. "You know I'm not easy to be around," she said. "I've noticed. I have opinions about how things should be done, and I'm not always quiet about them." "I've noticed that too. And I don't know how to—" She stopped, tried again. "I'm not always good at the soft parts of things, feelings and all of it. I work better with problems I can see." "Eliza." He said her name simply, without impatience. "I'm not asking for perfect. I've been around long enough to know that perfect isn't a real thing." He tilted his head slightly. "I'm asking for you, what you actually are." She stood there in the October evening with the mud still on her boots and thought that of all the things she'd been offered in her life, the kitchen work, the condescension, the charity wrapped in expectation, no one had ever said anything quite like that to her. "Yes," she said. It came out quieter than she'd expected. He let out a breath. "Yeah?" "Yes." Steadier this time. She almost laughed at the look on his face, that specific look of a man who is braced for a setback and doesn't quite know what to do when it doesn't arrive. "Don't make it strange, Caleb." He laughed then, a short, real laugh, the kind he rarely produced, and it sounded like something that had been waiting a long time to come out. Martha took the news with characteristic economy. They told her at supper, both of them sitting there with the slightly awkward air of people announcing something they're not sure how to announce. Caleb said it plainly. He'd asked Eliza to marry him, and she'd said yes, and he hoped Martha was amenable. Martha looked at him, then at Eliza. Then she picked up her fork and went back to her supper. "I know," she said. "You know," Caleb repeated. "I've known for 2 months." She pointed her fork briefly in Eliza's direction. "She took longer to decide than I expected, but she got there." She ate a bite of salt pork. "We'll need to see about a dress. That blue one I gave her won't do for a wedding." Caleb looked at Eliza. Eliza looked at Martha. "I like the blue dress," Eliza said. "You'll like a proper wedding dress more," Martha said, with the authority of someone who has made a decision on behalf of everyone else and does not anticipate further discussion. "And we'll need to let the carver operation know, since Caleb will need an extra hand come spring if we're expanding the east pasture the way you're talking about." "That's very practical," Eliza said. "I am a practical person." Martha stood up from the table and picked up her plate. She stopped beside Eliza's chair on her way to the counter, and she put her hand, dry, bony, with that surprisingly firm grip, briefly on Eliza's shoulder, just for a second. Then she moved on. Eliza looked at the table. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It wasn't the kind of thing that gets written about or remembered in specific words. But it was Martha Mercer, who had spent 40 years keeping the world at a careful distance, and it was her hand on Eliza's shoulder, and that meant something that no dramatic gesture could have carried better. They were married in November before the first hard freeze in a small ceremony at the ranch. The preacher came from town. Martha sat in the chair they'd brought out into the yard and wore her good coat and did not cry, which was exactly what anyone would have expected of her. Dora Phelps came, which was either a social calculation or a genuine change of heart, and Eliza decided to accept it as the latter because life was easier that way. Dan Fremont came, the man from the Carver operation who had stood up at the community meeting, and he shook Eliza's hand afterward with a brief firmness and said, "Congratulations, Mrs. Mercer." And that was all, but it was enough. Gerald Marsh sent a card. He did not attend. Winter settled over the ranch the way winters do in Kansas. Hard, serious, not interested in sentiment. The pipes froze twice in January. A section of the barn roof took on weight from a heavy snow and cracked a rafter that took 3 days to repair properly. The cattle needed daily checking through the worst of it, which meant mornings and temperatures that made your face ache before you'd been outside for 5 minutes. None of it was easy. None of it was the soft-focus version of a life rebuilt. But there were also evenings by the stove when the 3 of them, Caleb with his accounts, Martha with her mending, Eliza with whatever needed doing, sat in the same room, and the quiet between them was the kind that comes from people who no longer need to fill silence to feel comfortable in each other's company. There were mornings when Eliza woke up in an actual bed in an actual room that was hers and felt the particular solidity of that fact. Not took it for granted, not turned it into something larger than it was, but felt it, specifically the way you feel something true when you've spent a long time without it. In February, Martha's health declined for about 3 weeks. Something respiratory, not catastrophic, but serious enough that Eliza took over most of the kitchen work, and Caleb spent more evenings than usual sitting near her. Martha bore it with the stoic annoyance of someone who found being fussed over nearly as difficult as being ill. She recovered. She complained afterward that they'd both been hovering, and Eliza said they had been, and Martha said, well, she supposed it was tolerable, and that was as close to thank you as it was going to get, and everyone understood that. No. By the following spring, the Mercer Ranch had taken on one additional hand, a young man named Perry, 18 years old, who had shown up on the road much the way Eliza once had, though with rather more of a note of desperation about him, and rather less of a poker face. Eliza had been the one to see him from the field, and walk over and hear him out, and she had brought him back to the house and told Caleb they had room for one more. Caleb had looked at her with an expression she recognized. "You sure?" "He knows horses," she said. "He's green everywhere else, but you can teach green. You can't teach instinct." Perry stayed. He was not always easy. He made the particular kinds of mistakes that 18-year-olds make, impatient, occasionally careless, better at starting things than finishing them. Eliza was harder on him than Caleb was, which surprised Perry and didn't surprise Caleb at all. One evening Perry said to her, slightly aggrieved after a correction, "You're tougher than any foreman I've worked for." "You've worked for 2 people including us," Eliza said. "Your sample size is limited." She handed him the tools she'd been using. "Do it again, and do it right this time." He did it again. He did it right. Summer came back around, and with it the high white sky and the heat that cracked the earth and the grass going the color of old straw in the south pasture. But this time the south pasture was resting, as planned, and the cattle were in the east field where the grass was heavy, and the water supply was clean and consistent, and the yield projections for fall were the best they'd been in a decade. None of that was magic. It was rotation and water management and fence maintenance and showing up every day to the work even when the work was hard and the reward was not immediately visible. It was the accumulated result of small correct decisions made consistently over time, which is what most things worth having are actually made of, though people tend to want a more dramatic explanation. Eliza knew the dramatic version of her own story. She'd heard people in town starting to tell it, the way communities do when something that happened in their midst begins to calcify into a kind of local legend. A woman nobody would hire. The ranch that was saved. She'd heard it from Dora Phelps, who had turned from a source of harm into something approaching an unlikely advocate, mostly because Dora Phelps loved a story, and this one had turned out well enough to be worth telling fondly. The dramatic version wasn't wrong, exactly, but it was incomplete the way all dramatic versions are incomplete, because what it left out was all the days in between the significant moments, the days that were just work and weather, and coffee going cold, and boots that needed mending, and a pump that needed checking, and the slow understanding, built not in one revelation but in 100 small ordinary moments, that you are somewhere you belong. One evening in late July, Eliza was on the fence rail of the near paddock, watching the horses in the evening light, the same fence rail she'd sat on the night Martha had come out and told her she was thinking about leaving. The bay mare was near the far fence, fat and easy, completely recovered in body, and apparently untroubled by whatever memory horses keep. Caleb came and leaned on the fence beside her. They watched the horses for a while. "Perry set that last post too shallow," she said. "I know. I'll have him redo it tomorrow." "The whole section, if you do one." "I know, Eliza." She looked out at the pasture. The light was going that copper color again, the way it does in Kansas in late summer, and the land was very still, and somewhere out beyond the east field the creek was running, and the grass that had been worn down to dirt 6 months ago was growing back green. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "That I've been a lot of places, and most of them had something to offer and something wrong with them, and I stayed until the wrong outweighed the something." She paused. "This is the first place where I think the math is going the other direction." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "The math," he said. "The math." He looked at her sideways, and she looked at him sideways, and they were both trying not to smile in the particular way of two people who have been together long enough to find each other funny in ways nobody else would understand. "Well," he said, "I'm glad the math is working out. Don't make it sentimental." "I wouldn't dare." The horses moved in the fading light. The land went quiet around them the way it does at the end of a day. Not silently, because there was always sound, always the creek and the wind and the cattle and the last birds, but quietly, with a kind of letting go that the plains do every evening and that Eliza had stopped taking for granted. She had been told, by more people than she could now count, that she was not the kind of person who got to have this. A place. People. The specific ordinary weight of a life that was hers. She had never entirely believed them. She had also never been certain they were wrong, and that uncertainty, that long uncomfortable middle space between knowing you deserved something and being able to actually claim it, was the truest part of the story. Not the hard work, not the community meeting, not the letter from the bank with its standard terms. Those were real, but they were the surface. Underneath was a woman who had spent years carrying the quiet damage of being told she was less than she was, and who had kept going anyway. It's not because she was unaffected, not because she was stronger than she looked, but because she simply did not know how to stop. That was the thing nobody said when they told the story. That survival is not always a choice. Sometimes it's just what you do when you don't know what else to do. And sometimes, if you keep doing it long enough, you walk up a road in a cracked boot and find the one place where the right people are already waiting to see you clearly. Eliza Whitmore. Eliza Mercer. Now, though she still signed her work orders with both names because old habits die slow, climbed down from the fence rail when the light was nearly gone. "I'm going in," she said. "I'll be right behind you." She walked across the yard toward the kitchen window's yellow glow, and behind her she heard Caleb say something quiet to the bay mare as he passed the paddock, the way he'd taken to doing when he thought nobody was listening, and the mare made the low sound horses make when they recognize a voice they trust. She went inside. Martha had left coffee on the stove. It was still warm.